and so we settle in. You can feel your body beginning to grow heavy in the most pleasant way. In our time together tonight, there is nothing to examine, nothing to understand, only the gentle rhythm of a story. A story about a time when the world was bathed in a brownish, sepia light, a time when life was fragile, and saying goodbye was a very, very elaborate art. Before we drift too far, if you feel a connection to this place, you're welcome to leave a quiet like or subscribe. Think of it not as a task, but as leaving a soft footprint in the sand before you continue your journey inward. And if you feel so inclined, you might even leave a comment, letting me know in which city and at what quiet hour you are listening. It's a nice thought, knowing we are all sharing this quiet, scattered across the sleeping globe. Alright, let the shadows in your room grow long and soft. Maybe you can hear the faint sound of your own breathing. And together, let's allow the story to begin. The first thing you notice is the smell. It's a mix of coal smoke, damp wool, and horses. You're standing on a cobblestone street, and the air is thick with a hazy, yellow-grey fog that softens the edges of everything. Gas lamps are beginning to flicker to life, casting long, dancing shadows that make the familiar seem strange. This is the world of the Victorians. It's a world of incredible progress, of steam trains and telegraphs and factories churning out the wonders of a new age. But beneath all that clatter and invention, there is a deep, abiding quiet. It is the quiet of constant, ever-present loss. Let's be honest. If you were dropped into this time, your chances of making it through the first year would be questionable. You see, death isn't a shocking interruption to life here. It's a house guest that never truly leaves. Nearly 1 in 3 infants don't survive to see their 5th birthday. A simple infection, a winter cough, a contaminated glass of water, these are all potential death sentences. The toll of a church bell announcing a funeral is as common a sound as the rattle of a carriage on the stones. Because of this, people have a relationship with death that feels utterly alien to us now. It's intimate, it's familiar, and it has rules. So many rules. You walk past a photographer's studio. In the window are portraits of families. But you pause, squinting in the dim light. The people look so stiff, so serious. They have to. Of course, early photography required sitting perfectly still for what felt like an eternity. But there's another reason for their solemn expressions. They knew that for many, this photograph might be the only image of them that would ever exist. It was a document for posterity, a just-in-case memento. In a world without social media and camera phones, a single portrait carried the weight of a lifetime. And this constant proximity to the end created some very specific anxieties. One of the most widespread, and frankly terrifying, fears of the era was being buried alive. Tapophobia, they called it. Newspapers were full of narration. Sensationalized stories of people waking up in their own coffins. And so, an entire cottage industry of safety coffins sprung up. Imagine that. You're at an inventor's exhibition, and he proudly displays a coffin equipped with a little bell on a string. So you could, in theory, ring for help from 6 feet under. Some designs even had breathing tubes and complex systems of levers. It sounds like a joke, but it was a genuine, commercial response to a very real and pervasive public fear. This is the backdrop for everything we're about to explore, a society that is, on the one hand, obsessed with scientific progress and rigid social order, and on the other, haunted by a deep, gothic anxiety about what lies beyond. Historians are still debating whether the elaborate mourning rituals that defined this age were a healthy, structured way to process grief, or a form of oppressive social theater that trapped people, especially women, in a state of perpetual, public sadness. Was it a genuine outpouring of feeling, or a kind of societal pressure cooker, where everyone had to perform their sorrow in exactly the right way, for exactly the right amount of time? As you stand in this foggy, sepia-toned world, you can feel the weight of it all. The weight of heavy wool coats, of unspoken fears, and of strict expectations. For now, it's just the hum of a society chugging along. But all of this disquiet, simmering obsession with death, is about to get a royal seal of approval. High up in the palaces, a young queen is deeply in love with her husband. They are the picture of domestic bliss, surrounded by their growing family. They have no idea that their personal tragedy is about to be magnified, broadcast across the entire empire, and in doing so, will turn the intricate art of mourning from a private sorrow into a grand, public spectacle that will define an entire generation. That young queen is Victoria, and right now, in the middle of the 19th century, her world is a whirlwind of lightened color. If you could step inside the palace walls, you wouldn't find a stuffy, silent museum. You'd find a home. You'd hear the laughter of children echoing down the long corridors, the squeak of toys on polished floors, the sound of a piano being played, often by her husband, Prince Albert. He is the calm center of her very emotional world. She is the queen of the most powerful empire on the planet, but in her letters and diaries, she is a woman utterly, completely, and incandescently in love. He is her angel, her master, her everything. They are a team. He advises her on matters of state, champions art and science, and masterminds the Great Exhibition, a spectacular showcase of industrial might. They are, for all intents and purposes, the world's first great celebrity couple, and their happy, fertile family life is the model to which the entire nation aspires. But now, the air in Windsor Castle begins to change. It is December. Yabadoo-yo. I do. Wet cold has settled over the land, and Albert is not well. At first, it's just fatigue. Sleep, sons. The doctors are summoned. They whisper amongst themselves, their faces grim. They offer a diagnosis that strikes fear into any Victorian heart. Typhoid fever, a disease of tainted water, a roll of the dice. Victoria is frantic, refusing to believe it's serious. You can almost feel her pacing the cold stone floors outside his sick room, her anxiety a palpable force. You can hear the hushed shuffling of servants, the clinking of medicine bottles, the desperate, heavy silence that falls over a house holding its breath. Then, on a dark, rainy Saturday, the breath is released in a single, shattering gasp. Prince Albert is gone. He is just 42 years old. For Queen Victoria, the world doesn't just stop. It shatters into a million pieces. Her grief is not a quiet, private affair. It is a tsunami. It is absolute. She later writes that her life, as a happy one, is over, ended, and she means it. The vibrant, colorful world of the young queen is extinguished, and in its place, a vast, dark emptiness descends. This is where her personal tragedy becomes public policy. Victoria doesn't just mourn her husband. She turns mourning into the central project of her existence. And here you find one of the strangest, most poignant expressions of that grief. You are allowed to walk, silently, into Albert's rooms in the castle, and they are exactly as he left them. Decades after his death, his dressing room is maintained as if he might walk in at any moment. Every single morning, servants bring hot water for his shave. They lay out his clothes for the day. The sheets on his bed are changed regularly. His inkwells are kept filled, his handkerchiefs swayed out. It is a shrine, a perfect, heartbreaking time capsule of denial, preserved by the order of the most powerful woman in the world. From this epicenter of personal sorrow, the shockwaves radiate outward. The Lord Chamberlain issues orders for the court to enter the deepest possible mourning, a period that will last far longer than any precedent. And because the court sets the standard for high society, and high society sets the standard for the aspiring middle class, the entire nation follows suit. What was once a collection of traditions is now codified, amplified, and given the ultimate royal endorsement. Historians still argue about this point. Did Victoria create the oppressive mourning culture we associate with her era? Or was she simply its most famous and influential practitioner? The answer is likely somewhere in the middle. The rules were already there, but her obsessive, decades-long adherence to them made them absolute. She didn't invent the playbook, but she made it the law of the land, socially speaking. The demand for mourning clothes, particularly black ones, explodes overnight. Textile mills in the north of England go into overdrive, producing endless bolts of the required somber fabrics. A whole new vocabulary of grief becomes common knowledge. Suddenly, everyone needs to know the difference between first mourning and second mourning, the correct width of the black border on their stationery, the appropriate length of a widow's veil. Her Majesty's great sorrow has become the nation's sorrow, and expressing it correctly is now a mark of respectability, patriotism, and social standing. You look around you, and the world is already beginning to change. The vibrant colors you saw in shop windows are slowly being replaced by shades of black, gray, and melancholy mauve. The Queen has retreated from public life, but her image is everywhere. Multiplied in newspapers and photographs, she is no longer the youthful monarch, but a new, formidable figure, the widow of Windsor, and in her shadow, an entire generation will learn to grieve by her example, turning the intimate act of saying goodbye into a complex and demanding public performance. The first act of this play always begins in the stillness of a home that has just received the worst possible news. The news has arrived. It might have been a telegram, delivered by a boy with a smudge of dirt on his cheek. The message inside a gut punch of terse, formal words, or perhaps it was the doctor, descending the staircase, his face a mask of professional sympathy. Unable to meet your gaze. It doesn't matter how it came. The result is the same. The house, which moments before was filled with the ordinary sounds of life, a ticking clock, a crackling fire, the distant clatter of dishes, is now submerged in a profound and unnatural silence. This is the first stage. This is the stillness. You're standing in the hallway of a respectable middle-class home. Let's imagine it's your home. The air grows heavy, thick with unspoken thoughts. The first thing that happens is a series of quiet, deliberate actions. Someone, perhaps a steady-handed aunt or a close family friend, moves with a somber purpose. Their first task is to go to the room of the deceased. The curtains are drawn, plunging the room into a dim, perpetual twilight. This isn't just for atmosphere. In an age before modern embalming was common, especially for home funerals, darkness and cool air were practical necessities to slow down the inevitable processes of nature. The body is washed and dressed. This is an intimate, final act of care, usually performed by the women of the family or a hired nurse. They are dressed not in a shroud, but in their best clothes, a man in his finest suit, a woman in her favorite dress. The aim is to make them look as though they are merely sleeping. This ideal of the beautiful death is a cornerstone of the Victorian mindset. They are trying to soften the harsh reality, to present a final image of peace and repose for the family to hold on to. You might notice them tying a ribbon or a handkerchief around the jaw, a gentle but firm bind to ensure the mouth remains closed, preserving that serene, sleeping expression. Next, the watch begins. This is the wake, a tradition stretching back for centuries, but the Victorians perfected its somber tone. Family and the closest of friends will sit with the body around the clock until the funeral. You are now part of this silent vigil. You sit on a stiff back chair in the dimly lit parlor, where the deceased has been laid out, perhaps on their own bed moved downstairs, or in a coffin that has been delivered with startling efficiency. The air is thick with the scent of flowers, usually white ones like lilies, whose heavy, sweet perfume is meant to be pleasant, but also serves a more practical, scent-masking purpose. It's during this time that a fascinating and somewhat macabre piece of social theatre plays out. The Victorians had a deep-seated fear of being declared dead prematurely. So during the wake, people would watch for any sign of life, but they also had another, stranger custom, the sin eater. This is one of those practices that sounds like something from a fantasy novel, but it was a real, if rare, folk tradition that survived into the 19th century in some rural areas. A designated person, usually a poor outcast, would be called to the house. A piece of bread and a bowl of ale would be passed over the body of the deceased and then given to the sin-eater. By consuming them, he was believed to be taking on the sins of the departed, allowing their soul a clean passage to the afterlife. It was a fringe practice, for sure, and one that upper-class society looked down upon. But historians confirm its existence. A spooky remnant of a much older world lingering in the gaslight. As you sit in this quiet room, watching the flicker of a single candle, you are acutely aware of the rules that are already in motion. The family is now in complete seclusion. The front door will not be open to casual visitors. A servant, her face a picture of solemnity, will be tasked with turning away callers, accepting cards of condolence on a silver tray, and speaking only in hushed tones. The family is in a bubble of grief, a state of suspended animation between the moment of death and the finality of the funeral. And all around you, the house itself is being transformed. It's not just about drawing the curtains. The home is being dressed for mourning, just as the family will be. It is being scrubbed of anything that suggests life, joy, or vanity. It is a process that is both deeply symbolic and, to our eyes, incredibly strange. Every reflective surface is about to become a source of profound superstitious anxiety. A window that must be covered, a portal that must be sealed. The stillness is just the beginning. The house itself must now be blinded. The stillness in the house is one thing, a quiet born of shock and sorrow, but what comes next is a deliberate, methodical campaign against the ordinary. You watch as a family member, her movements slow and precise, walks to the grand mental pace clock in the parlor. With a soft click, she stops the pendulum. Its rhythmic, comforting tick-tock. The heartbeat of the home ceases. The silence it leaves behind is deeper, more absolute. This is often the very first ritual. The act of stopping the clocks at the moment of death is a powerful symbol. Time, for the deceased, has ended. For the family, normal life is now suspended. The home has officially entered a different kind of time, a liminal space governed by the pace of grief. Now, your attention is drawn to the mirrors. A servant enters the room carrying a pile of white or black linen sheets. She moves to the large, gilt-framed mirror hanging over the fireplace and carefully, meticulously, drapes the fabric over it, securing it with pins. She does the same to the smaller looking glass in the hallway, to the polished surface of a sideboard, to any and every object that could cast a reflection. Suddenly, the rooms feel smaller, muffled, claustrophobic. The light that once bounced around the space is now absorbed by the dull cloth. Why this obsession with covering mirrors? It's a superstition so ancient its origins are lost to time. But the Victorians embraced it with fervor. There were several intertwined beliefs at play. The most common was the idea that the soul of a person who had just died was still lingering in the house for a few days. A mirror, being a sort of magical portal, could trap the soul, preventing it from moving on to the afterlife. You wouldn't want your dear departed Aunt Mildred stuck in the whole mirror for eternity, now would you? Another, slightly more unnerving, belief was that if you saw your own reflection in a room where someone had just died, you would be the next to go. It was a form of bad luck, the dark omen. So covering the mirrors was an act of spiritual hygiene and self-preservation. It was a way of making the house safe for the living while ensuring a safe passage for the dead. Academics are still in a lively debate about the precise psychological roots of this practice. Was it a genuine folk belief? Or was it more of a symbolic active way of turning away from vanity and personal appearance at a time of deep sorrow? In a culture so focused on external presentation, perhaps blinding the house to its own reflection was the only way to signal that such worldly concerns were, for a time, meaningless. But the preparations don't stop there. You notice that even family portraits on the walls were sometimes turned to face the wall, or draped in the same black cloth. Anything that represented the vibrancy of life, even a painted image, was to be muted. In some households, straw or timber would be laid down on the street outside the front door. This was a very practical measure. designed to muffle the sound of horses' hooves and the iron-rimmed wheels of carriages on the cobblestones, ensuring the bereaved family was not disturbed by the noise of the outside world. It was an outward signal to the entire neighborhood. This is a house of mourning. Tread softly, speak quietly. It's in these small, specific rituals that you see the Victorian mind at work. It's a fascinating blend of deep-seated folk superstition and a very modern desire for order and control. In the face of the ultimate chaos, death itself, they created a rigid system of rules. Stopping the clock, tottering the mirror, laying the straw, these were all ways of imposing a man-made order onto a terrifying, uncontrollable event. It gave the grieving something to do, a script to follow when the emotional reality was too overwhelming to comprehend. While all this is happening, another quiet transformation is taking place. You see the women of the house begin to go through their wardrobes, pulling out any black items they own. But for most, what they have will not be enough. It won't be the right shade of black, the right fabric, or the right style. An urgent message is sent to a draper or a seamstress. The machinery of a great and profitable industry is beginning to wear into life, sparked by this single, quiet death. Because before the funeral can even be planned, before the announcement cards can be sent, the family must be properly attired, and to navigate this complex world of somber fashion and funeral arrangements, a new and indispensable figure is about to arrive at your door. He is a professional, a master of ceremonies for the final act. He is the undertaker. There is a soft, respectful knock at the door. When it's opened, a man stands on the threshold, a figure of impeccable, somber dignity. He is dressed head to toe in black, his suit perfectly tailored, his top hat held respectfully in his gloved hands. His face is a carefully composed mask of professional sympathy. This is the undertaker, or as he might prefer to be called, the funeral director. He is a relatively new phenomenon, a product of the Victorian era's love for specialization, professionalism, and, let's be frank, commercial opportunity. He steps inside, and his presence immediately changes the atmosphere. Where there was the aimless, heavy grief of the family, there is now purpose and direction. He speaks in a low, measured voice, a tone that is both comforting and authoritative. He is here to take charge of the arrangements. Before men like him, funeral preparations were a messy, ad hoc affair handled by the family, the church, and various local tradesmen, the carpenter for the coffin, the sexton for the grave. But in this new urban world, with its growing middle class and its obsession with doing things properly, the undertaker emerges as a master coordinator, a one-stop shop for a respectable send-off. You follow him as he is led into the parlor to meet the head of the household, likely the eldest son or the grieving widow, who sits, not too comfortably, on the edge of a chair and produces a small, leather-bound notebook. This is where the business of death begins. With gentle, practiced questions, he guides the family through a bewildering array of choices. What kind of coffin would be suitable? He might show them illustrations or even small models. Oak for sturdiness and simplicity, or perhaps mahogany with elegant brass fittings for a man of a certain station. And what about the lining? Simple linen, or padded satin for a greater sense of comfort. Each choice comes with a different price tag, a silent but powerful pressure to choose the best to show the depth of one's love and the height of one's social standing. Then come the other details. The hearse, would they prefer a simple one, or a grander carriage with glass panels and carved wooden flourishes? The number of horses to pull it. 2 is standard, 4 is respectable, 6 is for the truly important. And of course, the plumes. We'll talk more about those magnificent ostrich plumes later. But for now, you just need to know that the undertaker is carefully noting down the family's choice of color and number. He will arrange for the obituary to be placed in the newspapers. He will coordinate the hiring of the mutes, professional mourners who would stand with grim faces at the door, and the pallbearers. He will oversee the creation of the memorial cards, those little black-edged souvenirs of the deceased. He is, in essence, an event planner for the saddest event of a family's life. And this profession, like so many others, has its own strange quirks. For instance, have you ever heard of a coffin plate? In the days before widespread photography, these were small, engraved plaques, usually silver or brass, that were fixed to the lid of the coffin. They bore the name and dates of the deceased. But here's the odd part. Often, an identical, duplicate plate would be made for the family to keep. It would be mounted on a piece of polished wooden hung in the parlor. A stark, metallic memento of the person they had lost. The rise of the undertaker was not without controversy. Many, including the famous author Charles Dickens, were critical of the profession. They saw these men as opportunists who preyed on the vulnerability of the bereaved, upselling them on extravagant funerals they couldn't afford, turning a sacred rite of passage into a grotesque display of conspicuous consumption. Historians continue to debate this image. Were undertakers cynical businessmen? Or were they providing a genuinely needed service in an increasingly complex society, helping families navigate a difficult process with dignity and order? The truth, as always, is probably a mix of both. As the undertaker concludes his business, he stands, gives a slight, respectful bow, and lets himself out. He leaves behind him a list of tasks, a schedule, and a hefty future bill, but he also leaves a sense of control. The chaotic, emotional tide of grief has been channeled into a series of manageable, practical decisions. The family now has a plan, and part of that plan, for many, involves one last, curious act of preservation before the final goodbye. It's an act that takes place in the very room where the deceased lies sleeping, an act that involves a bright flash of light and a desire to stop time forever. The undertaker has left, and a different kind of professional now arrives. He doesn't carry a leather-bound notebook, but a heavy wooden box filled with glass plates, chemical bottles, and a large, intimidating camera on a tall, spindly tripod. He is a photographer, and he has been summoned for a very specific, and to our modern eyes, deeply unsettling, purpose: to take a photograph of the deceased. This is post-mortem photography, or as the Victorians more gently called it, a memento mori, a remembrance of death. You follow him into the darkened parlor where the family member lies in repose. The air is still and heavy. The photographer works with a quiet, practiced efficiency. This is not some fringe, ghoulish practice. For much of the Victorian era, it is a common, almost expected, part of the grieving process. Remember, in a world where photography is expensive and cumbersome, many people, especially children, might live their entire short lives without ever having their picture taken. For their grieving parents, this post-mortem photograph isn't a morbid souvenir. It is the one and only image they will ever have of their lost child. It is a desperate attempt to capture a shadow before it fades completely. The photographer's goal is to create an image of peaceful slumber, not of death. He carefully arranges the scene. The deceased, often a small child, is posed in a crib or a tiny bed, tucked in with their favorite blanket, a beloved toy placed in their hand. Their head is gently propped up on a pillow. If the person is older, they might be posed in a chair, as if they have just nodded off while reading a book. The aim is a gentle, romanticized fiction. It is a photograph of a loved one who is not gone, but merely sleeping. But creating this illusion took some very clever, and sometimes unnerving, techniques. The photographer might use a hidden metal stand, a kind of brace that would hold the person's head and torso upright from behind, ensuring they didn't slump during the long exposure time. For children, the mother would often be in the photograph as well, draped in a dark cloth or a floral pattern to act as a kind of anonymous backdrop, her arms holding her child steady one last time. If you look closely at these photos, you can sometimes see the faint outline of her hand, a ghostly presence of love and sorrow. And here is a small, specific detail that is both heartbreaking and a little bizarre. Photographers would sometimes gently tint the cheeks on the finished photograph with a faint rosy pink. They might even go so far as to paint open eyes onto the closed eyelids of the subject on the photographic plate itself. It was a final, desperate attempt to literally paint life back into the image, to create a portrait that defied the finality of the moment. Historians still debate the emotional impact of these images. Did they bring genuine comfort to the bereaved, a tangible memory to cling to, or did they prolong the agony, creating a false image that made acceptance of the death even more difficult? It's a question we can't really answer, as it's so deeply personal to the families who commissioned them. The most poignant and common of these portraits were of infants and young children. You might see a photograph of a baby in a beautiful white christening gown, lying on a satin pillow, looking for all the world like they are just about to wake up, but the stillness is too perfect, the hands too composed. Or you might see a family portrait. The father stands, hand on his wife's shoulder. An older sibling stands beside them. And seated on a small chair in the middle is a younger child, formally dressed, but with a vacant, distant look that the long exposure time cannot fully explain. They are the center of the portrait, the reason for its existence. It is their first and last family photo. When the photographer is done, he packs away his equipment. He has captured a flicker of light on a glass plate, freezing a moment of profound sadness. The family will receive the finished portrait, perhaps in a small, ornate frame or a velvet-lined case. A few weeks later, it will become one of their most treasured possessions, a silent testament to a life cut short. This desire to keep a physical part of the loved one, to have something tangible to hold, doesn't end with a photograph, and even more personal, and far more intricate. Token is about to be created from the one part of the body that does not decay, the hair. Before the coffin lid is closed for the final time, a quiet and deeply intimate ritual takes place. A woman, perhaps the mother or the widow, leans over her loved one. In her hand, she holds a small, sharp pair of scissors. With the utmost care, she snips a lock of hair. She holds it in her palm, a soft, silky curl that still seems to be filled with the warmth and life of the person who is gone. This act of taking a lock of hair is an ancient tradition, but the Victorians, with their love for intricate craft and sentimental keepsakes, elevated it into a complex and ubiquitous art form. This lock of hair will not simply be tucked away in a locket or pressed between the pages of a Bible. It will be sent to a specialist, a hair weaver or jet worker, who will transform it into a piece of mourning jewelry. You are now inside the quiet, dusty workshop of one such artisan. The room is filled with spools of fine wire, tiny tools like dental picks, and trays of clasps and beads. On the work table, under the focused glow of a gas lamp, you see the hair being meticulously cleaned and sorted, strand by strand. The process is incredibly painstaking. The hair is arranged on a special palette, and then, using a technique that is a cross between braiding and lace making, the artist begins to weave. They might create a flat, fabric-like sheet of hair that can be placed behind glass in a brute, or they might weave it into a hollow, three-dimensional tube to create a bracelet or a necklace chain. Often, the hair of a deceased child would be woven together with a lock from the mother and father, creating a poignant, genealogical artwork that bound the family together even after death. You look at the finished pieces on display. They are astonishingly intricate. There are brooches where the hair has been chopped into a fine powder and mixed with adhesive to be used as a kind of paint. With this, the artist creates delicate scenes under a crystal dome, a weeping willow tree drooping over a tombstone, a woman in black weeping gracefully, the initials of the deceased spelled out in tiny, golden letters. These are not just crafts. They are miniature memorials, each one telling a story of loss. But it didn't stop at jewelry. For the truly dedicated mourner, hair could be used to create much larger, more elaborate pieces. You might see a framed artwork, a hair wreath, hanging in a family's parlor. These were large, horseshoe-shaped or circular wreaths, sometimes containing the hair of dozens of family members, both living and dead. Each flower, each leaf, Each delicate tendril in the wreath would be crafted from a different person's hair, carefully labeled on the back. It was a family tree rendered in the most personal medium imaginable. It is, to us, profoundly strange, but to them, it was a way of keeping their ancestors physically present in the home. One particularly quirky fact: blonde hair was the most difficult to work with. It was finer, more brittle, and tended to resist the tight weaving techniques. Brunette hair was considered the ideal medium for the serious hair artist. The academic world still holds a quiet fascination with this practice. Some historians see it as a beautiful, sentimental expression of love and remembrance, a way to keep a physical part of a person with you always. Others view it with a more critical eye, seeing it as part of the Victorians' broader tendency to fetishize death, to turn organic human remains into sanitized, decorative objects. Was it a comfort, or was it just creepy? Like so much from this era, it manages to be both at the same time. This jewelry, these intricate weavings of hair, would become part of the official uniform of grief. A widow would pin a brooch made from her husband's hair to the collar of her dress, a constant, physical reminder of her loss. It was a conversation piece, but only a very specific, somber kind of conversation. It was another way to perform her role as a mourner, to display the permanence of her sorrow for all to see. And this performance was about to be dictated by the most unforgiving, uncomfortable, unfriendly, scratchy fabric imaginable. A fabric that would come to define the very look of Victorian grief. Black crepe. Suddenly, the house is a flurry of activity, but it's a grim, joyless kind of energy. The funeral is approaching, and the family is not properly attired. A kind of quiet panic sets in. A trip must be made, immediately, to a mourning warehouse or a draper's shop. These establishments, which sprung up in every major city, were the 19th century equivalent of a crisis response center. You step inside one. The air is heavy with the dry, slightly acrid smell of new dye. Everything, and I mean everything, is black. Rows upon rows of black dresses, black bonnets, black gloves, black fans, black parasols, black everything. It is a vast, monochrome universe of sorrow. But your eye is drawn to one fabric in particular. It's a stiff, dull, non-reflective material with a strange, crimped texture. Like hardened gauze, it feels slightly scratchy and unpleasant to the touch. This is crepe, specifically paramotor crepe, a blend of silk and wool, treated with heat and pressure to give it its distinctive puckered surface. And in the rigid hierarchy of mourning attire, this fabric is king. It is the official textile of deep mourning, the first and most intense stage of grief. You watch as a saleswoman, herself dressed in respectable black, attends to a newly widowed woman. The widow must be outfitted from head to toe, and the amount of crepe required is staggering. It will be used for her dress, for the long, heavy veil that will cover her face, for the trim on her bonnet, even for her cape. The symbolism of crepe is crucial. It has no sheen, no luster. It absorbs the light, just as a mourner is meant to absorb their grief, turning inward and reflecting nothing of the joyful world outside. It is, in essence, an anti-fashion statement. It is designed to be plain, uncomfortable, and suffocating. And here's a bizarre, and slightly miserable, little detail about this fabric. Black crepe was notoriously susceptible to water damage. The dye was unstable, and if a grieving widow were to be caught in a rain shower, or even shed a few too many tears, the black dye could run, staining her face and clothes with dark, inky streaks. Furthermore, the fumes from the dye process were often toxic, containing arsenic and other chemicals. There are documented cases of seamstresses and even the wearers of these heavy crepe veils suffering from skin irritation, respiratory problems, and in some extreme cases, even partial blindness. It was a fabric that not only symbolized sorrow but could cause very real physical suffering. The demand for crepe and other mourning fabrics was so intense that it created what some historians have called the mourning industry. Huge department stores, like Jay's of Regent Street in London, specialized entirely in mourning wear. They offered everything a grieving family could possibly need, even offering to send representatives to the home to take measurements, sparing the bereaved the ordeal of a public shopping trip. These businesses ran on a model of urgency. An advertisement for one such establishment read, "On receipt of letter or telegram, competent assistants are sent to any part of England." They were, in a way, the emergency services of social decorum. But this rigid requirement for a whole new wardrobe created immense social pressure and financial strain, especially for middle and lower class families. You had to have the right clothes, not just for yourself, but for your entire household, including your servants, who would also be expected to wear black armbands or ribbons. Failing to do so would invite gossip, judgment, and whispers that you weren't showing the proper respect, that your grief wasn't sincere. Many families had to go into debt to afford a decent mourning. As you watch the widow being fitted for her heavy, scratchy, suffocating new clothes, you see that this is not just about personal expression. It is about conforming to a strict, unwritten social code. The clothes are a uniform, and the woman wearing them is about to enlist in a long and arduous campaign of public sorrow. Her outfit, known grimly as her widow's weeds, will become her identity, a heavy shroud that separates her from the rest of the world and defines her place within it. It is a state of being that she will be expected to inhabit for at least a year, and likely much, much longer. The day of the funeral arrives. You are standing discreetly in the corner of a bedroom, watching the widow prepare. The room is quiet, save for the rustle of stiff fabric. She is getting dressed. But this is not a daily ritual of choosing an outfit. This is an act of encasement, of putting on a shell. She is donning her widow's weeds, and the term itself, derived from an old word for garment, carries a heavy, almost suffocating weight. First comes the dress itself. It is made of that dull, lifeless paramotor crepe over a base of plain wool. There is no decoration, no lace, no embroidery, not even a shiny button. Every seam, every fold, is designed to communicate utter desolation. The dress is high-necked and long-sleeved, covering her from wrist to throat. It is heavy, cumbersome, and in the summer months, unbearably hot. It is a physical burden, a constant, scratchy reminder of her new status. Next, her hands are covered in gloves of black kid leather or suede. Even a glimpse of skin is considered improper during this first, deep stage of mourning. Then comes the bonnet. It too is covered in crepe, a severe and simple shape that frames her face, shielding her from the world's gaze. But the most dramatic element is yet to come. Attached to this bonnet is the veil. This is not a delicate, gauzy wisp of fabric. This is a formidable curtain of heavy, opaque crepe. In the first year of mourning, the veil is worn long, sometimes reaching down to the hem of her dress, completely obscuring her face and entire body from view. When she walks, she is a moving column of black, an anonymous silhouette of grief. She has to see the world through this thick, light-absorbing mesh, which makes everything blurry and indistinct. It isolates her, creating a literal and figurative barrier between her and the living. Navigating the world from behind this veil is a physical challenge. Crossing a street, or even walking down a staircase becomes a hazardous act. And here's a peculiar social detail that illustrates the intense scrutiny these women were under. Etiquette manuals of the day offered stern advice on the proper management of this veil. For the first year, it was to remain down, covering her face in public at all times. After that, during second mourning, it might be pinned back, but it still had to be worn. Lifting the veil too soon, wearing one of a lighter, less oppressive material, was a source of intense gossip. It would be interpreted as a sign of disrespect, a hint that she was not grieving deeply enough, or worse, that she was already looking to attract a new suitor. This entire ensemble is her uniform for a full year and a day. That is the absolute minimum prescribed by the strictest social code. During this time, she is expected to live in near total seclusion. She cannot attend parties, balls, or the theatre. She cannot receive social visitors, only close family and intimate friends. Her life shrinks to the four walls of her home. She has effectively become a social ghost, present but not participating in the vibrant life of the world. Historians and sociologists are still deeply divided on the function of this practice. Was it a protective cocoon? A way of giving a woman a socially acceptable space and time to grieve, free from the pressures of public life? Did this uniform shield her from unwanted attention and allow her to navigate the world without having to put on a brave face? Or was it a form of social control? A prison of black fabric that erased her identity, advertised her availability on a future market, and kept her tethered to her deceased husband's memory? There is no single answer. For some women, it may have been a comfort. For many others, it was an oppressive, an isolating sentence. As you watch her adjust the heavy veil over her face, the world outside her window dissolving into a dark, blurry pattern, you realize the immense disparity of this cultural burden. Her husband is gone, but the world expects very little of his male counterparts in their public display of grief. Their path will be far simpler, their burden infinitely lighter. Now shift your focus. Look across the room, where the widow's brother, or perhaps the deceased son, is also getting ready. His process is starkly different. There is no pile of scratchy, unfamiliar new clothes. There is no suffocating veil. His display of grief is a study in minimalist discretion. He walks to his wardrobe and selects one of his existing suits. It is, of course, the dark one black, or a very deep charcoal grey. It is well made, respectable, but it is fundamentally the same kind of suit he would wear to church or a formal business meeting. His sartorial nod to mourning is small, subtle, and temporary. The most common signifier is a simple black band of cloth, usually crepe or ribbed silk, pinned or sewn around the sleeve of his coat, typically on the left arm. It's a clear and unambiguous signal of his status as a mourner. But it is also easily removable. He can take off his coat, and with it, the most visible sign of his grief. This is a luxury the widow, encased in her weeds, could not even imagine. His other accessories are similarly understated. He will wear black gloves, a black cravat or tie, and a black top hat, often with a wide crepe band wrapped around its base. That's it. There is no requirement for him to purchase an entirely new wardrobe. There is no expectation that he cover his face or radically alter his silhouette. His grief is an accessory, while the widow's grief is her entire identity. And the timeline for his mourning is drastically shorter and more flexible. While a widow is expected to be in deep mourning for at least a year, a widow might only be expected to do so for a few months. 3 to 6 was considered perfectly respectable. After that, he could remove his armband, return his regular colored cravats to his wardrobe, and re-enter social life. He could go to his club, attend dinner parties, and conduct his business with very little interruption. His period of seclusion is brief, a respectful pause rather than a prolonged sentence. This stark double standard reveals a great deal about the Victorian worldview, particularly concerning gender roles. A man's identity was tied to his public life, his profession, his role in the world of commerce and politics. A prolonged and ostentatious display of grief was seen as unmanly, overly emotional, and disruptive to the important business of the empire. His duty was to remain stoic, to manage the estate, and to ensure the family's continued stability. His grief was a private matter, and his public acknowledgement of it was meant to be dignified but brief. A woman's identity, on the other hand, was almost entirely defined by her relationship to men as a daughter, a wife, a mother, and finally, a widow. Her husband's death was not just an emotional loss. It was a fundamental shift in her social and economic standing. Her elaborate mourning costume was a public signal of this new, dependent status. It was also, in a way, a testament to her late husband's importance. The depth and duration of her mourning reflected his status and her devotion to him. A widow who moved on too quickly was not just disrespecting his memory, she was, in a sense, devaluing his worth. Here's a little known, and rather telling, bit of etiquette. One of the very few acceptable reasons for a man to wear a full, deep black suit for an extended period was if he was a member of the clergy. Vicars and priests were often seen as being in a state of professional, perpetual mourning for the sins of the world, so their somber attire was considered appropriate to their station. For any other man, however, wearing such unrelieved black for too long might attract concerned glances, whispers that he was perhaps a bit too sentimental, a bit unstable. There is, of course, an ongoing scholarly conversation about whether this disparity was as rigid in practice as it was in the etiquette books. Personal letters and diaries from the period suggest that many men felt grief just as deeply and protracted as women, but the crucial difference lay in social expectation. A man grieving for years was an object of some pity or concern. A woman doing the same was simply doing her duty. As the gentleman pins the simple black band to his sleeve, the contrast is complete. He can put on his grief like a piece of armor, a temporary shield. She is required to disappear inside of hers. He will walk out into the world. She will retreat from it, and caught somewhere in the middle of these two extremes are the most vulnerable members of the household. The children. In the quiet hush of the house, you now notice the children. They are often overlooked figures in the grand drama of Victorian mourning, but they are participants nonetheless, dressed in their own miniature versions of grief. They stand silently, their small faces pale and confused, miniature adults in a world that has suddenly become somber and incomprehensible. Their clothing, like that of their parents, is strictly dictated by the rules of mourning, but with some very specific and symbolic differences. You see a young girl, perhaps 8 years old. She isn't dressed in the oppressive, heavy black of her mother. For children, unrelieved black was often considered too harsh, too grimly adult. Instead, her dress is made of a soft white fabric, like cotton lawn or muslin. White, in this context, symbolized innocence. It was the color of purity, suggesting that the child was too young to fully comprehend the darkness of death. But her dress is not entirely white. It is trimmed with black ribbons. A wide black sash is tied around her waist, and the hem of her dress is adorned with rows of black tucks or bands. Her straw bonnet is similarly white, but its ribbons are black. It's a striking, almost stark, visual statement. Innocence marked by sorrow. A slightly older girl, perhaps in her early teens, might be dressed in grey. Grey was the color of half mourning, a transitional shade for a young woman on the cusp of adulthood. It was considered a more appropriate and less severe option than the full black of a widow. It signaled that she was part of the grieving family, but still retained a degree of youthful softness. The boys, like their father, had it much simpler. A young boy would be dressed in a dark suit, often navy or charcoal grey, with a simple black armband pinned to his sleeve. He is a miniature version of his father, his grief expressed with the same masculine restraint. For all the children, their playthings would be put away, their laughter would be shushed. They would be expected to behave with a quiet solemnity that was often far beyond their years. This expectation of adult-like composure from children is one of the most heartbreaking aspects of the era. The Victorians, for all their sentimentality about childhood innocence in art and literature, often had a very different approach in reality. Children were to be seen and not heard, and this was doubly true in a house of mourning. They were discouraged from asking too many questions, from expressing their grief in loud or messy ways. They were expected to perform their role in the family's public display of sorrow. And here lies a small, tragic detail that is often hidden in the census records and parish registers of the time. The mortality rate for children was, as we've noted, terrifyingly high, but a strange and sad phenomenon sometimes occurred in the wake of a mother's death. The survival rate of the youngest child, especially an infant who was still nursing, would often plummet. In an age before a reliable baby formula, a mother's death was often a death sentence for her baby as well. The mourning clothes being prepared for the mother would, in some tragic cases, soon be needed for her child too. The question of how children were meant to process grief is a subject of ongoing study. Some historians argue that the very public and ritualized nature of Victorian mourning, while oppressive, at least gave children a clear script to follow. The visible signs of grief, the clothes, the drawn curtains, the hushed voices made death a tangible, acknowledged event, unlike our modern tendency to shield children from it. Others argue that this formal, theatrical approach was deeply damaging, forcing children to suppress their natural feelings and anxieties, leading to a lifetime of unresolved trauma. As you watch these children, dressed in their symbolic black and white, you realize they are living in a paradox. They are treated as miniature adults, expected to bear their sorrow with quiet dignity, yet their clothing marks them as innocents who must be shielded from the full weight of the tragedy. They are caught between two worlds, the protected realm of childhood and the harsh reality of an adult world defined by loss. And soon, they will be asked to participate in another solemn ritual, one that involves pen, ink, and a very specific kind of paper. The news of the death must be formally announced, and even this act is governed by its own rigid set of rules. The house is quiet, the family is dressed, but the world outside remains unaware. The next step is to formally announce the death to friends, distant relatives, and the wider social circle. This is not done with a simple telephone call or a quick text message. It is a formal, almost ceremonial process, conducted through the post. You find yourself in the study, a room that smells of leather books and beeswax polish. On a large mahogany desk, a member of the family, perhaps an adult son with neat handwriting, is undertaking this solemn task. Before him is a box of mourning stationery. To a casual observer, it might just look like paper and envelopes, but to a Victorian, it is a complex system of codes, a way to communicate the depth and stage of one's grief without saying a word. You lean in for a closer look. The paper itself is of a high quality, thick and creamy, but its most striking feature is the border. Around the edge of each sheet is a thick, black band of ink. This is deep mourning paper. The border is strikingly wide, perhaps a quarter of an inch. A stark black frame for the sad news that will be written within. The etiquette surrounding this border was astonishingly precise. For the first year of mourning, the border had to be this deep, funeral black. As time went on and the mourner moved into the later stages of grief, the black border would shrink. After a year, it might be reduced by half. 6 months after that, it would become a thin, delicate black line. Eventually, it might be replaced with a grey or mauve border during half mourning, before the writer finally returned to plain, unbordered stationery. You could, in essence, track a person's entire grieving process, year by year, just by the letters they sent you. To use a border that was too thin for your stage of mourning was a social misstep, a sign of disrespect. Even the envelopes were part of this code. They too had a black border, and they were sealed not with ordinary glue, but with black sealing wax. A special stamp, or signet, would be pressed into the warm wax, instead of a family crest. This stamp would bear a suitably somber image, a weeping willow, an urn, a dove, or a simple, mournful motto like in remembrance or gone but not forgotten. Every single detail was calibrated to convey a message of profound loss. The message written on the paper itself was usually brief and formulaic. It would state, with deep regret, the passing of the family member, and provide the details of the upcoming funeral. These were not letters for pouring out one's heart. They were formal announcements. In addition to these letters, the family would have small, pre-printed cards made. These were memorial cards, and they were another essential part of the stationery suite. They would feature the deceased's name, dates of birth and death, and often a sentimental poem, a Bible verse, or a small, engraved illustration of an angel or a heavenly gate. These cards would be sent out after the funeral, and recipients would often collect them, keeping them in special albums, creating a kind of morbid scrapbook of all the friends and relatives they had lost over the years. And here's a rather curious tidbit about this tradition. The obsession with mourning stationery became so pervasive that even Queen Victoria herself, the ultimate trendsetter in grief, eventually thought it had gone too far. Late in her reign, she issued a statement from the court declaring that she found the use of the deepest black bordered paper to be distressing and preferred a much thinner border. But by then, the trend had taken on a life of its own. Stationers and etiquette gurus continued to promote the thick bordered paper for decades, a testament to how deeply ingrained these rules had become. The debate among social historians about this practice is a quiet but persistent one. Was this intense focus on the minutiae of stationery a meaningful ritual that helped people structure their grief? Or was it just another form of conspicuous sorrow, a way for the middle and upper classes to display their social refinement and their financial ability to afford such expensive, specialized paper goods? Perhaps, like so many of these customs, it was both. It was a way to channel overwhelming emotion into a manageable, rule-bound task. The act of sitting down, dipping a pen in ink, and carefully forming the words on that black-edged paper was a quiet, contemplative moment in the whirlwind of funeral preparations. And once those letters were sealed with black wax and sent on their way, the final public performance could be prepared. The funeral procession itself. The day of the funeral has a distinct sound. It is the slow, rhythmic clap of horses' hooves on cobblestones, the soft creak of leather harnesses, and the rumble of iron-rimmed wheels. You are standing on the street as the funeral procession begins to form outside the house of the bereaved. The centerpiece of this somber parade is the hearse, and it is far more than just a vehicle for transportation. It is a rolling stage, a piece of theatrical equipment designed to broadcast a very specific message about the deceased and their family. Your eyes are immediately drawn to the horses. They are magnificent, powerful animals, always black. With coats groomed to a high sheen, they move with a deliberate, dignified slowness. But it's what they are wearing that is most striking. They are draped in black velvet cloths, called POS, which are often decorated with the family-esque coat of arms or the initials of the deceased in silver embroidery, and on their heads, they wear the most dramatic accessory of all, the plumes. These are huge, cascading bunches of ostrich feathers, dyed black, mounted on the horses' heads and on the four corners of the hearse itself. They bob and sway with a kind of hypnotic, melancholy grace as the procession moves. And these plumes are not just for decoration. They are a vital part of the semiotics of the Victorian funeral. They are a status symbol, a public advertisement of the family's wealth and social standing. The number of plumes on the hearse is a direct communication to every onlooker. An ordinary, respectable middle-class funeral might have a pair of plumed horses. A more affluent family might spring for a truly grand, aristocratic affair could feature 6 plumed horses and a hearse so heavily decorated with feathers it looked like a giant, mournful bird. The quality and abundance of these feathers were a subject of intense scrutiny and neighborhood gossip. Having a good funeral was one of the most important social duties of the era, and the plumes were the most visible measure of your success. But here is the wonderfully bizarre and slightly absurd side of this custom. This hierarchy of plumes was so well established that it even had a name. Plumage, a clever pun on plumage and peerage. Undertakers had a sliding scale of costs. You could order a funeral with a 2-plume level of dignity, or you could pay for the top-of-the-line 6-plume extravaganza. For those who couldn't afford to buy their own, a whole industry of funeral rental existed. You could hire the plumes, the hearse, the horses, and even the professional mourners for the day, creating an illusion of wealth and status that might be far beyond the family's actual means. There's a quiet, ongoing discussion among historians about the psychological function of this display. Was it simply a crass show of wealth? A way of keeping up with the Joneses even in death? Or was it a genuine attempt to honor the dead in the most lavish way possible? A final, public gift to the person they had lost. It's easy for us to see it as cynical, but for many Victorians, the idea of skimping on a funeral was a source of deep shame and anxiety. It was seen as a failure of love and duty. As you watch the undertaker, in his black suit and top hat, directing the formation of the procession, you see other figures taking their places. There are the mutes, those hired mourners we mentioned earlier. They are tall, somber-looking men who stand at the door of the house and walk at the head of the procession, carrying long, crepe-draped staffs. Their job is simply to look sad. They are the living statues of grief, paid to add an extra layer of solemnity to the proceedings. Behind the hearse, a line of carriages begins to form. These are for the family and close friends. The carriages are also black, drawn by black horses, and the blinds are pulled down on the windows, shielding the grieving family from the public's gaze. The order of the carriages is also strictly determined by protocol, with the closest relatives riding directly behind the hearse. The entire procession is a meticulously choreographed piece of street theater, a slow, dark river of sorrow flowing through the bustling city. And as it begins its journey, every person on the street will stop what they are doing, and the men will remove their hats. A small but universal gesture of respect as the parade of death passes by. The procession begins to move. The pace is agonizingly slow, a deliberate, walking tempo that forces the entire city to pause and take notice. This is the funeral cortege, and its journey from the home to the church, and then from the church to the cemetery, is a public performance on a grand scale. You fall into step, a silent observer walking along the pavement, watching this slow parade of sorrow unfold. The sheer spectacle of it is captivating. The gleaming black hearse, perhaps with glass panels on the sides to display the ornate coffin within. The horses, with their nodding black plumes and velvet coverings. The long line of closed carriages, each a private, mobile capsule of grief. The whole procession might stretch for several city blocks. A stark, black interruption to the normal flow of traffic and commerce. Carts and omnibuses pull to the side of the road. Pedestrians stop, their conversations dying on their lips. Men, from the wealthiest banker in his fine wool coat to the humblest street sweeper with his broom, remove their hats and hold them over their hearts. It is a moment of shared, public reverence. This is not just a way to get from point A to point B. It is a powerful social statement. The length of the procession, the number of carriages, the quality of the horses, all of it is a final, public testament to the deceased's station in life. For a prominent public figure, a great statesman or a beloved author like Charles Dickens, the funeral procession could be a massive public event, drawing tens of thousands of onlookers who would line the streets for miles. A collective outpouring of national grief. But even for an ordinary middle-class family, the procession is a crucial part of the ritual. It is the moment they publicly display their loss. It is a way of saying to the world, this person mattered. Their absence leaves a void not just in our home, but in the fabric of this community. It is an act of claiming space, of forcing the bustling, indifferent city to acknowledge a private tragedy. As you walk, you might notice other participants, hired professionals who add to the pomp and solemnity. In addition to the mutes at the head of the procession, there might be pallbearers walking alongside the hearse. Even if the coffin is not being carried by hand, these men, dressed in black with sashes across their chests, are there for symbolic effect. And here's a rather curious and class-conscious detail. There were different grades of hired mourners. For a truly lavish funeral, an undertaker could provide gentlemen feathermen, who were responsible for the care and display of the ostrich plumes, and pages, young boys dressed in somber livery, all to heighten the sense of grandeur. Historians have long debated the true meaning of this public theater. Was it a healthy way for a community to participate in a family-esque grief, a moment of shared humanity in an otherwise anonymous urban environment? Or was it, as many contemporary critics claimed, a vulgar and expensive form of social climbing? The pressure to stage a grand procession could be immense, often leading families to spend far beyond their means. The cost of hiring the hearse, the horses, the carriages, and all the professional attendants could be ruinous, a debt that a widow might be paying off for years. The procession also served a very practical, if grim, purpose. It was a clear, unambiguous announcement of the death to anyone who might have missed the notice in the papers or the black-edged card in the mail. In a world of slow communication, this slow parade was the most effective way to spread the news. Finally, after what feels like an eternity, the procession reaches its destination. It passes through a set of high, ornate iron gates. The sound of the horses' hooves changes as they move from the hard cobblestones of the city to the soft gravel pathways of a new and revolutionary kind of place. The air grows quieter. The smell of coal smoke is replaced by the scent of damp earth and evergreen trees. You have arrived at the final resting place. But this is not some crowded, chaotic old churchyard. This is something new, something grand and beautifully landscaped. This is the Victorian Garden of Death. You step through the gates and the city seems to fall away behind you. The air is still, the light filtered by the leaves of tall cypress and weeping willow trees. You are in one of the new garden cemeteries, one of the Victorian era's most beautiful and enduring innovations. Before this, burial grounds in a city like London were a grim and frankly unsanitary affair. For centuries, people were buried in small, overcrowded churchyards in the city centre. Space was so limited that graves were constantly being dug up to make room for new occupants, a practice that was both disrespectful and a serious public health hazard. The ground was literally saturated with human remains. But now, you are walking down a wide, gracefully curving path. All around you are rolling hills, artfully arranged groves of trees, and manicured flower. This place feels less like a graveyard and more like a public park, and that was precisely the intention. Starting in the 1830s, a movement began to create these large, private, non-denominational cemeteries on the outskirts of the city. Places like Highgate in London or Mount Auburn in Boston were designed to be beautiful, tranquil, and contemplative landscapes. They were conceived as places not just for the dead, but for the living. Families would come here on a Sunday afternoon, not just to visit a specific grave, but to take a stroll, to admire the art and architecture of the monuments, to enjoy a moment of peace and nature away from the smoke and clatter of the city. The garden cemetery was a destination, a place for quiet recreation and moral reflection. It was a complete reimagining of the relationship between the living and the dead. Instead of hiding death away in a foul-smelling pit, the Victorians gave it a beautiful, landscaped home. As the funeral procession makes its way slowly along the winding paths, you look at the monuments that lined the way. This is a city in miniature, an acropolis of grand and elaborate architecture. You see towering obelisks of polished granite, echoing ancient Egypt. You see classical temples with soaring columns, miniature Greek Parthenon nests for a single family. There are Celtic crosses covered in intricate knotwork, and soaring Gothic spires that mimic the great cathedrals of Europe. Each tomb, each mausoleum, is a statement of wealth, status, and taste. It is the family's final, permanent address, and they wanted it to be a good one. This created a kind of architectural competition among the affluent. Families would hire the most fashionable architects of the day to design their final resting places. You might see a tomb shaped like a grand four-poster bed for a husband and wife, or an elaborate stone sarcophagus carved with scenes from the deceased's life. And here's a rather charmingly eccentric fact. At Highgate Cemetery in London, one of the most famous tombs belongs to a man named George Roomwell, who was a famous menagerie owner. His tomb is topped with a life-sized sculpture of his favorite lion, peacefully asleep. It was a way to make even your eternal home a deeply personal statement. There is an ongoing scholarly discussion about the motives behind this movement. Some historians see it as a beautiful expression of the Romantic era's love of nature and a more compassionate, sentimental view of death. It was a way to soften the harshness of loss by placing it in a picturesque, pastoral setting. Other, more cynical historians point out that these were private, for-profit enterprises. They sold burial plots like real estate, and the best spot on a hilltop with a good view cost a premium. They argue that the garden cemetery was less about sentiment and more about the privatization and commercialization of death. As with most things Victorian, the truth is likely a blend of sincere feeling and savvy business. The procession finally halts before a freshly dug plot of earth. The coffin is carried to the graveside. The family gathers around. Their black forms a stark contrast to the green grass and the colourful flowers of a neighbouring grave. The final prayers are said. The final goodbyes are whispered. The coffin is lowered into the ground. But even here, on the very soil of the grave, there are symbols to be read. A final language of stone and flowers that is meant to communicate a message to all who will visit in the years to come. The final handful of earth has been tossed onto the coffin. The sound is a soft, hollow thud that seems to echo in the quiet air of the cemetery. The funeral service is over, but the act of memorializing has just begun. In the coming weeks or months, a permanent marker will be placed here, a headstone that will stand as a final, silent statement. And these stones are not just random pieces of granite or marble. They are covered in a rich and complex visual language, a dictionary of symbols that any well-educated Victorian could read and understand. You walk away from the fresh grave and wander through the older sections of the cemetery, and it's like walking through an open-air art gallery. You pause before a tall, elegant headstone. Carved at the top is a weeping willow tree, its long, graceful branches drooping sadly downwards. This is one of the most common symbols you will see. The willow has long been associated with grief and mourning. Its sorrowful posture a perfect visual metaphor for the feelings of the bereaved. Nearby, you see a stone for a young person. Instead of a willow, it features a broken column, or a rosebud snapped from its stem. The meaning is immediate and heartbreaking. A life cut short, a potential that was never fulfilled. A small lamb is often used to mark the grave of an infant or a young child, a symbol of innocence and gentleness. You continue your walk and your eye catches other, more complex symbols. A hand pointing upwards is a clear and hopeful sign, indicating that the soul has ascended to heaven. Two hands clasped together often mark the grave of a married couple, a symbol of their final farewell on earth but also their eternal bond. An anchor, which you might think is only for a sailor, was actually a common symbol of hope. The anchor of the soul in the storms of life, a sleeping cherub, its head resting on its arm, doesn't just represent a child, but the idea of sleep itself, reinforcing that gentle Victorian notion of death as a peaceful rest. The variety is astonishing. Doves for peace and the Holy Spirit. Oak leaves for strength and endurance. Ivy for its evergreen nature, representing eternal life and memory. A butterfly emerging from a chrysalis, a beautiful and optimistic symbol of resurrection. Even the type of stone used had its own meaning. White marble, so popular for the graves of women and children, symbolized purity and innocence, while the sturdier, darker granite was seen as more appropriate for a man, signifying strength and fortitude. And here's a wonderfully specific and slightly obscure piece of funerary symbolism for you. The inverted torch. You might see a carving of a classical-style torch, but held upside down, with the flame pointing towards the earth. This wasn't a sign of despair. In classical symbolism, a torch held this way didn't mean the flame was extinguished, but that it was continuing to burn in the underworld, or the next life. It was a sophisticated, neoclassical way of expressing a belief in the soul's immortality. The academic interpretation of this language of stones is a fascinating field. Art historians study the evolution of these symbols, tracing their origins from classical antiquity, Christian iconography, and even Masonic traditions. Sociologists look at how the size and expense of the monument reflected the social class of the family. The wealthiest families had towering monuments covered in elaborate sculptures, while a poor family might only be able to afford a small, simple stone with just a name and dates. The cemetery was, in death as in life, a landscape deeply marked by social hierarchy. But as you stand in this quiet garden of stone, you realize that for all their public, performative nature, these symbols were also a source of genuine, private comfort. For a grieving family, choosing the right symbols for their loved one's headstone was a final act of love and care. It was a way to distill a whole life, a whole personality, into a few, carefully chosen images. It was a way to ensure that the person they lost would continue to speak to future generations, even if only in this silent, symbolic language. The grave is now marked, a permanent fixture in this garden of memory. But for the living, the journey of mourning is far from over. They must now return to their quiet, darkened home and begin the long, slow, and incredibly restrictive period of social hibernation. The carriages have returned from the cemetery. The heavy front door of the house closes with a soft, final click, shutting out the rest of the world. The funeral is over. The last of the sympathetic visitors have departed, and now, the real work of mourning begins. For the family, especially for the widow, life is about to enter a period of profound and enforced quiet. This is the stage of social seclusion, a time when the calendar is wiped clean and laughter is an unwelcome sound. You are now a silent observer inside this house of mourning. The days stretch out, long and monotonous. The family lives in a kind of bubble, a self-imposed quarantine from the normal rhythms of life. For the widow in her deep mourning weeds, this period of seclusion will last for at least 1 full year. During this time, she is not to accept any social invitations, no dinner parties, no concerts, no trips to the theater, no balls. Her social life, once a source of pleasure and connection, is completely extinguished. Even within her own home, she is not to entertain. If a friend calls, they might be received, but only in a quiet, informal way. There will be no music, no games, no light-hearted conversation. The piano in the corner of the parlor remains closed and silent, its keys gathering a thin layer of dust. The novels on the shelf, unless they are of a religious or moral nature, are left unread. Anything that smacks of levity or entertainment is considered deeply inappropriate, a sign of a shallow and unfeeling heart. The days are structured around quiet, domestic, and religious duties. The widow might spend her time sewing, reading the Bible, writing letters on her black-bordered stationery, or managing the household accounts. Her world is shrunk to the size of her own home. When she does venture out, it is not for pleasure. She might go to church, in fact. This is one of the few public appearances that is encouraged, or she might take a quiet, solitary walk in the park. But even then, shielded by her heavy veil, she is not meant to engage with the world, merely pass through it like a ghost. This enforced isolation had a profound psychological impact. For some, it may have been a welcome respite, a time to grieve without the pressure of social obligations. But for many, it was a recipe for deep depression and loneliness. And here's a small but chilling detail from the etiquette manuals of the time. A widow was strongly advised against having her photograph taken during her first year of mourning. Why? Because the act of posing for a portrait was seen as an act of vanity, and vanity had no place in the heart of a true mourner. Her identity was to be completely subsumed by her grief. There's a continuing debate among social historians about the true purpose of this seclusion. Was it really about protecting the mourner's feelings, or was it more about protecting society from the uncomfortable reality of grief? A person in deep mourning, especially a widow, was seen as a figure of bad luck, a living memento mori. Her presence at a cheerful social gathering would cast a pall over the event, a grim reminder of mortality. By keeping her hidden away, society could maintain its cheerful facade, its forward-looking optimism, without being dragged down by her sorrow. It was a form of social hygiene, quarantining the sad so the happy could continue to be happy. The rules were, of course, slightly more relaxed for men. A widower was also expected to withdraw from society for a time, But his period of seclusion was much shorter, perhaps only a month or two. After that, he could begin to accept quiet dinner invitations, though he was expected to avoid bars and other large, frivolous gatherings for a while longer. His work, his club, his public life, these were allowed to resume with minimal interruption. As you watch the seasons change through the parlor window of this quiet house, you feel the oppressive weight of this enforced idleness. The silence is broken only by the ticking of the clock, which has now been restarted, the rustle of a black dress, and the occasional sigh. It is a long, slow, and lonely vigil, but it is not meant to last forever. The rigid Victorian system, for all its harshness, has a built-in path back to the world. It is a slow, gradual re-entry, marked not by a sudden change, but by a subtle shift in the color palette, a careful and deliberate return of muted, gentle color. A year has passed. A full cycle of seasons has been weathered inside the quiet, shadowed rooms of the house. From the window, you have watched the world go on the bright tresses of spring, the vibrant energy of summer, the golden melancholy of autumn. But inside, the world has remained a monochrome of black. Now, however, a subtle change is permitted. A small, cautious step is being taken back towards the light. The family is transitioning from deep mourning into second mourning. You watch the widow as she consults a lady's magazine or an etiquette book. These publications are her guides, her instruction manuals for navigating the complex next phase of grief. The rules are just as precise as before, but now they involve a gradual reintroduction of texture and color. The oppressive, scratchy, and frankly unpleasant paramotor crepe can finally be put away. This in itself is a significant moment of liberation. The physical discomfort of deep mourning is eased. In its place, she is now permitted to wear fabrics that have a slight sheen or a softer texture. Black silk, velvet, and cashmere are now acceptable. The dresses might feature more elaborate tailoring, with pleats, ruffles, and trimmings, as long as those trimmings are also black. Jet, a fossilized wood polished to a deep, lustrous black, becomes the jewelry of choice. Intricate necklaces, brooches, and earrings made of jet add a touch of somber sparkle to her attire. Her heavy, face-obscuring veil can now be lifted and pinned back, allowing her to see the world clearly, and for the world to see her, for the first time in a year. After another 6 months to a year in this stage, she can progress to half mourning or light mourning. And this is where the first hints of color are allowed to creep back into her wardrobe. But not just any color. The acceptable shades are muted, somber, and deeply symbolic. You might see her in a dress of a deep, dusty purple, a dark shade of mauve, or a soft, dove gray. These colors are seen as respectful, gentle transitions away from the starkness of black. They are the colors of twilight, of shadows, of a sorrow that is beginning to soften at the edges. This color-coded system of grief is a fascinating piece of social psychology. It provided a clear, visible timeline for a widow's re-entry into society. When a woman appeared at a social gathering in a grey dress, it sent a clear signal to everyone. She is still in mourning, but she is now available for quiet conversation and gentle social interaction. She is no longer a figure of complete desolation. And here's a wonderfully quirky detail that emerged from this trend. The color mauve, a sort of pale, grayish purple, became incredibly fashionable during the Victorian era. Its popularity was given a huge boost in 1856 when a young chemist named William Henry Perkin accidentally synthesized the first aniline dye, a vibrant shade he called Mauve. The color became a sensation, but it also found a permanent home in the world of mourning attire as one of the very first colors a woman could wear after black. Queen Victoria herself often wore shades of mauve and violet in her later years, a subtle nod to her perpetual state of half mourning. The debate among historians about this gradual recoloring of grief is ongoing. Was it a sensitive, structured process that gently guided a person from the depths of sorrow back into the light of normal life? Did it provide a helpful, external framework for an internal, emotional journey? Or was it just another form of social control, a way for society to dictate the exact pace and presentation of a person's emotions? You've had your year of black, the system seemed to say. Now it is time to move on, to become less of a social burden, to start wearing grey. As the widow puts on her first lavender-trimmed bonnet, she can also begin to slowly re-engage with her social life. She might attend a quiet concert, a small afternoon tea, or a church social. The process is slow, tentative, and every step is scrutinized. She is still a figure defined by her widower, but she is no longer a complete outcast. She is a woman in transition, and this transition inevitably leads to a very practical and very pressing question, one that society has a very strong opinion about, now that she is no longer in deepest black. When, if ever, is it acceptable for her to love again? The shades of grey and mauve have settled into the widow's wardrobe. She has begun, tentatively, to re-enter the social world. She can now attend a quiet dinner party, her face unveiled, her conversation polite and subdued, and in this new phase, a delicate and highly scrutinized question begins to hang in the air, the question of remarriage, for a widow or widower. Navigating the path to a second union was like walking a tightrope of social expectation, and the rules were, once again, dramatically different for men and women. Let's start with the widower. You see him, perhaps a year or so after his wife's passing. He has long since put away his black armband. He is a regular at his club, fully engaged in his professional life, and is once again a feature of the London social scene. For him, the question is not if he will remarry, but when and whom. Society not only permitted a man to remarry, it actively encouraged it. There were practical reasons for this. A man needed a wife to run his household, to manage the servants, and most importantly, to be a mother to his children. A widower with young children was seen as a particularly sympathetic figure, and his swift remarriage was considered a sensible and responsible act. The socially acceptable waiting period for a man was surprisingly short, while a year was considered respectful. Many men remarried much sooner, sometimes within 6 to 9 months, without raising too many eyebrows, especially if children were involved. His remarriage was viewed as a pragmatic decision, a restoration of the proper order of the family unit. Now, turn your attention back to the widow. Her situation is infinitely more complex. You see her at that same dinner party. She is a figure of quiet dignity, but she is also in a precarious position. For her, the waiting period was much, much longer. The absolute minimum, according to the strictest etiquette guides, was 2 years after her husband's death. To even consider a new relationship before that was seen as a profound betrayal of her late husband's memory. It suggested a lack of proper feeling, a shallowness of character. When she did finally emerge from her half-mourning, she entered a strange social landscape. A widow, especially a wealthy one, could be a very attractive prospect. She had social experience. She was often financially independent, and she was free from the control of her parents. However, this freedom was also a source of social anxiety. An independent widow was a powerful and slightly unpredictable figure in a patriarchal society. Her choice of a new husband was a matter of intense public interest and gossip. And here's a rather curious and somewhat cynical piece of social commentary from the period. Magazines and novels of the time are full of cautionary tales about the merry widow stereotype of a woman who, once freed from a restrictive marriage, enjoys her newfound independence a little too much. This character was often portrayed as flirtatious, financially irresponsible, and a danger to the established social order. This stereotype served as a subtle warning to real widows. Do not appear to be enjoying your freedom. Remarry, by all means, but do so with the proper gravity and decorum. The scholarly debate on this topic is rich and complex. Feminist historians, in particular, have analyzed the intense pressure on widows to remarry. They argue that it was a mechanism of social control, a way to ensure that a woman's property and person were once again placed under the authority of a husband. A single, independent widow was an anomaly that the system was eager to correct. Other historians take a more nuanced view, suggesting that for many women, a second marriage offered a return to companionship, financial security, and a stable social position, things that were very difficult for a woman to maintain on her own. As you watch the widow navigate the subtle currents of the drawing room, you see the calculations being made, both by her and by the eligible gentlemen who approach her. A potential suitor must be careful. His courtship cannot be rushed or overt. It must begin with quiet conversations, shared interests in literature or art, and a deep respect for her ongoing state of mourning. Any hint of unseemly passion would be a scandal. The path to a new life, for her, is not a sprint, but a slow, careful, and publicly judged marathon. And for some, in the midst of this long, lonely period, the desire to connect with the one they lost becomes so strong that it leads them down an even stranger, more mysterious path into the darkened rooms of the seance. The long, quiet years of mourning can create a profound and aching void. For some, the rituals of the church and the comfort of memory are not enough. A new and electrifying idea is sweeping across Europe and America. A promise that the veil between the living and the dead is not impenetrable after all. This is the age of spiritualism, and for many Victorians grappling with loss, it offers a tantalizing and deeply controversial hope of reunion. You find yourself invited not to a dinner party, but to a very different kind of evening gathering. You are led into the dimly lit parlor of a fashionable townhouse. The heavy velvet curtains are drawn, shutting out the last of the evening light. About a dozen people are seated around a large, heavy, circular table. The mood is a strange mix of nervous excitement and somber reverence. Many of the attendees are women, dressed in the grey and mauve shades of half-mourning. They are here for a séance. At the head of the table sits the medium. This could be a man or a woman, often someone with a charismatic, mysterious air. They claim to be a channel, a living telephone line to the spirit world. The medium instructs everyone to join hands, forming an unbroken circle. The gas lamps are turned down until the room is almost completely dark, the only light coming from a single, flickering candle in the center of the table. A deep, expectant silence falls over the room. The séance begins. The medium might go into a trance, their breathing becoming deep and ragged. Then, strange things start to happen. A cold draft seems to sweep through the sealed room. You might hear a soft trapping sound coming from the walls, or from the underside of the table itself. Believers interpret these raps as a code, a way for the spirits to answer yes or no questions. 1 rat for no, 3 for yes. A grieving widow might whisper, "Dearest Albert, are you here with us?" The room holds its breath, waiting for the 3 soft, ghostly taps in reply. The phenomena often become more dramatic. The heavy table might begin to vibrate, or even levitate a few inches off the floor, seeming to float in the darkness. Musical instruments, like a tambourine or a small guitar left in the corner of the room, might begin to play on their own. Whispering voices might seem to come from the ceiling. For a believer in that darkened room, these are not tricks. They are proof. They are tangible. Physical evidence that their loved one is not gone, but is right there, in that very room, reaching out across the Great Divide. Of course, this movement was rife with fraud, and this is where you find some of the most bizarre and ingenious trickery of the era. Skeptics and professional magicians, like the great Harry Houdini later on, dedicated themselves to exposing the methods of fraudulent mediums. They discovered mediums who had hidden accomplices, who used cleverly concealed wires to levitate tables, and who were masters of ventriloquisms. One particularly famous trick was the production of ectoplasms, a supposed spiritual substance that would emanate from the medium's body. In reality, it was usually just cheese or cough or muslin, which the medium had swallowed and would regurgitate at a dramatic moment in the darkness. The historical perspective on spiritualism is deeply fascinating. Was it, as the skeptics claim, a cruel and predatory industry that exploited the grief of the vulnerable? Or was it a genuine new religious movement that provided immense comfort and psychological relief to people in an age of rigid scientific rationalism and often sterile, formal religion? The truth is, it was both. For every charlatan, there were likely sincere practitioners who genuinely believed in their abilities, and for every person who was duped, there were countless others who found profound solace in the belief that they had spoken, one last time, to their departed husband, wife, or child, even very intelligent, prominent people, like the author Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of the hyper-rational Sherlock Holmes, became passionate, lifelong believers in spiritualism after losing his son. As the seance ends and the lights are turned up, you see the faces of the attendees. They look drained, but also serene, even joyful. They leave the house and step back into the gaslit streets, carrying with them the conviction that death is not the end. This belief, whether based on faith or fraud, was for many a vital coping mechanism in a society so saturated with death. It was another product, another service, offered by a world that had become incredibly adept at one thing, turning sorrow into a business. As you've journeyed through this somber world, you've seen the undertakers, the crate manufacturers, the mourning stationers, and the monument carvers. You've seen the photographers, the hair weavers, and even the spiritualist mediums. Now, step back and look at the whole picture. What you are seeing is the birth of a massive, interconnected, and highly profitable ecosystem built entirely on the foundation of sorrow. The Victorian mourning industry was a formidable economic engine, and it permeated every level of society. Let's return to that mourning warehouse we visited earlier, a place like Jay's in London. Imagine it not just as a shop, but as a full-service institution. You walk through the doors and you are in a world dedicated to the efficient processing of grief. On the ground floor, you find ready-to-wear mourning attire for every member of the family, in every size, for every stage of mourning. There are departments for crepe, for black silks, for half-mourning mauves. There's a millinery department for bonnets and veils, a glove department, even a section for black-edged handkerchiefs and somber, jet black fans. But it doesn't stop there. The store might have its own in-house dressmakers, ready for rapid, custom alterations. Advertisements from the period boast of widows' weeds of the best quality, sent by the next train to any part of the country. They understood the urgency. They operated like a modern-day emergency service. Upstairs, you might find a stationery department, offering a wide selection of black-bordered paper and memorial cards. Some larger establishments even had their own undertakers on staff, or at least a close partnership with a local firm, allowing a family to make all their arrangements, from the coffin to the widow's bonnet, under a single, very large roof. It was the world's first, and perhaps last, great department store of death. Now let's look at a smaller, more specialized industry. You're in the seaside town of Whitby, on the coast of Yorkshire. The Kisirara Dock, crumbly shale, and for centuries, locals have been picking up a strange, black, lightweight stone from the beaches. This is jet, a type of fossilized wood, and in the Victorian era, Whitby became the world capital for the production of jet jewelry. At the industry's peak in the 1870s, there were hundreds of workshops in this small town, employing over 1,000 men and women, carving and polishing this black amber into beads, crucifixes, and incredibly intricate brooches. When Prince Albert died, Queen Victoria wore Whitby jet for the rest of her life, and this royal endorsement created an insatiable demand. The entire economy of a town was built on the national obsession with mourning attire. This commercialization of grief was a subject of fierce debate, even at the time. Social critics like Charles Dickens and William Makepeace Thackeray wrote scathingly about the funeral mongers who profited from sorrow. They saw the whole affair as a grotesque pantomime of conspicuous spending, where the depth of one's grief was measured by the size of one's bill. A famous and slightly funny complaint from the era was the undertaker's sherry. It was a common custom for the undertaker to offer the bereaved family a glass of sherry during the arrangements, a gesture of comfort. However, critics pointed out that the cost of this complimentary sherry was, of course, quietly added to the final, exorbitant bill. Historians today are still trying to untangle the complex ethics and economics of this industry. Was it a cynical exploitation of human vulnerability? A system that forced people into debt in their darkest moments? Or was it simply the market responding to a genuine and deeply felt cultural need? The rise of a consumer society meant that every aspect of life, including death, was being turned into a commodity, a set of goods and services that could be bought and sold. The mourning industry wasn't necessarily evil. It was simply the logical endpoint of a society that demanded strict, elaborate rituals and was willing to pay for them. You can see the evidence of this industry everywhere. From the grand department store to the tiny hair weaver's workshop, it was a cradle to grave, or rather, graven beyond economy. It clothed the mourners, furnished the funeral, built the tomb, and even offered a connection to the afterlife. And presiding over it all, a silent, black-clad muse, was the one woman whose personal, prolonged, and highly public grief had set the tone for an entire generation. Let us return, for a moment, to where this all began in earnest, with the Queen. The years have turned into decades. The children of Victoria and Albert have grown up, married into the royal houses of Europe, and had children of their own. The world is changing at a dizzying pace. The first telephone has crackled to life. Electric lights are beginning to banish the gaslight glow, and the first motor cars are sputtering down city streets. But inside the walls of Windsor and Balmoral, time remains frozen in that one terrible moment in 1861. You see Queen Victoria now, not as the young, passionate woman she was, but as an old woman. She is a small, stout figure, a tiny monolith of sorrow, almost always dressed in unrelieved black. Her face, framed by a white widow's cap, is etched with the lines of a long and heavy sadness. She has become the Widow of Windsor, a title that has fused with her very identity for 40 years, from the day Albert died until her own death. She remains in a state of perpetual mourning. Her grief is not a quiet, private affair that softens with time. It is a public institution. She continues to sleep with a photograph of her late husband on the pillow beside her. Her personal stationery is perpetually edged in black. She commissions an astonishing number of monuments, memorials, and statues in his honor. The Royal Albert Hall, the Albert Memorial, countless statues and squares across the empire. These are all the products of her unrelenting need to memorialize him. She turns Great Britain into a landscape of her own personal sorrow. This 40-year performance of grief by the most famous woman in the world has a profound, chilling effect on fashion and culture. Because the Queen remains in mourning, mourning itself remains fashionable. The strict dress codes, the elaborate rituals, the heavy, somber mood, all of this is continuously reinforced by the example set at the very top of the social ladder. She is the ultimate influencer, and her product is grief. While a normal widow might transition to mauve and grey after a few years, the Queen's refusal to do so keeps the ideal of perpetual, deep mourning alive and potent for an entire generation. Here's a small detail that shows the depth of her obsession. Victoria and Albert had been deeply in love with Balmoral, their Scottish castle. After his death, she continued to make pilgrimages there, and insisted on maintaining every single one of his favorite walking trails and picnic spots exactly as he had left them. She would even have his pony, saddled and bridled, brought to the door each morning, as if he were just about to emerge for his daily ride. This was not just for a few years. This continued for decades. It was a private, heartbreaking ritual that mirrored the public preservation of his rooms at Windsor. Historians are still wrestling with the legacy of Victoria's long grief. Was it a profound expression of enduring love, a testament to a bond that not even death could break, or was it a form of pathological mourning, a refusal to accept reality that cast a long, dark shadow over the nation and her own family, her own children. In their private letters, often expressed frustration at the oppressive, melancholy atmosphere of the court. Her eldest son, the future King Edward VII, was kept from any real power or responsibility for decades, partly because his cheerful, pleasure-loving personality was a constant, jarring contrast to his mother's somber world. Her long reign, which gave the era its name, also gives us this paradox. The Victorian age was a time of incredible dynamism, optimism, and progress. It was an age of bold colors, grand ambitions, and a belief in a brighter future. And yet, at its very heart, sat a queen who refused to move on from the past, who draped her court and her empire in the permanent shadow of a single death. But even the most powerful trends eventually fade. As the 19th century draws to a close, you can begin to hear the first whispers of dissent. A new generation is rising, a generation that has grown up under this heavy, black pull, and they are beginning to question the utility, the sincerity, and the sheer, oppressive weight of this grand and somber pageant. The whole elaborate structure is beginning to feel a little bit tired. The gas lamps are giving way to the steady, clean glow of electric light bulbs. The slow clip-clop of horses is being challenged by the noisy, exciting sputter of the automobile. The world is on the cusp of a new century, and the mood is changing. A new spirit of modernity, speed, and pragmatism is in the air, and against this bright, energetic backdrop, the old, slow, and theatrical rituals of Victorian mourning are starting to look, well, a little bit ridiculous. You are now in a drawing room, but it's a different kind of drawing room from the ones we've seen before. The furniture is lighter, less ornate. The heavy velvet curtains have been replaced with lighter fabrics that let in the sun, and the conversation is different. You hear the voices of a new generation, women in tailored suits and men with forward-looking ideas, and they are beginning to openly question the traditions that their parents held so sacred. A writer in a popular magazine publishes a satirical essay on the mourning industry, mocking the undertakers with their fate, gloomy expressions, and the absurdly high cost of funerals. A social reformer gives a public lecture, arguing that the immense sums of money spent on ostrich plumes and elaborate stone mausoleums would be better spent on improving sanitation or building hospitals to prevent the very diseases that caused so many deaths in the first place. This is a new, pragmatic kind of thinking. Women, in particular, are beginning to push back against the suffocating expectations placed upon them. The new woman is emerging as a cultural figure. She is educated. She might have a career. She rides a bicycle. And she is far less willing to encase herself in a prison of black crepe for years on end. Feminist writers and activists argue that the traditional widow's weeds are a symbol of female oppression, the way of marking a woman as helpless and dependent. They advocate for a simpler, more rational, and more private form of mourning. You can see this shift in the fashion magazines of the late 1890s and early 1900s. While they still offer advice on correct mourning attire, the recommended periods are shorter, the styles are simpler, less cumbersome. The heavy crepe veil is falling out of favor, replaced by a lighter, shorter veil of gauze or netting. The entire performance is being toned down, becoming more of a personal choice and less of a rigid social mandate. And here's a rather interesting, and slightly funny, detail that illustrates this changing attitude. A new type of business begins to emerge, the funeral cooperative or burial society. These were organizations, often for the working classes, where members would pay a small weekly subscription. In return, the society would guarantee them a decent but simple funeral, free from the exorbitant and unpredictable costs of the private undertakers. It was a form of social insurance, a collective pushback against the commercial exploitation of grief. It was a way for ordinary people to reclaim some control over the process. The academic world has a name for this slow shift, the secularization of death. Historians argue that as religious belief began to wane slightly, and as science and medicine offered new explanations for life and death, the old, highly ritualized, and superstitious customs began to lose their power. People were becoming less concerned with the supernatural dangers of an unmourned spirit and more concerned with the psychological and financial well-being of the living. Of course, this change didn't happen overnight. For many, especially in rural areas and among the more traditional upper classes, the old ways held on for a long time. The death of Queen Victoria herself in 1901 prompted a massive, nationwide outpouring of public mourning that was, in many ways, the last great performance of the Victorian tradition. The streets of London were draped in black and purple, and the demand for mourning clothes saw a final, spectacular boom. But it was a last hurrah. The new king, Edward VI, was a man who loved life, colour, and gaiety. He quickly banished the somber, oppressive mood of his mother's court. The world was ready to move on. The foundations of the great, dark cathedral of Victorian mourning were already crumbling, and soon, an event of unimaginable scale would arrive, a cataclysm that would not just chip away at the old traditions, but would shatter them completely. The year is 1914. The bright, confident Edwardian summer, with its garden parties and straw boaters, is about to come to a brutal and abrupt end. A series of political miscalculations and imperial ambitions plunges Europe into a conflict of a scale and ferocity that the world has never seen. This is the Great War, and it will act as a vast, unforgiving furnace, burning away the last remnants of the 19th century world. You are no longer in a quiet, gossip parlor. You are on a train platform, crowded with young men in fresh khaki uniforms. Their faces a mixture of excitement and apprehension. They are going off to war, promising to be home by Christmas. The sheer number of them is staggering. This is not a small, professional army. This is a nation in arms, and the machinery of modern, industrialized warfare that awaits them will be horrifically efficient. The news that comes back from the front is not of glorious cavalry charges, but of a muddy, static, and nightmarish world of trenches, machine guns, and artillery. The casualty lists begin to grow. First, it's a trickle, then a steady stream, and finally, a flood. Every village, every street, every family seems to lose a son, a husband, a brother, a father. The scale of the loss is simply overwhelming. Death is no longer a singular, dramatic event that happens in a quiet bedroom. It is a mass-produced, anonymous horror, happening hundreds of miles away. In the face of this deluge of grief, the old Victorian rituals simply collapse. They are impossible, impractical, and suddenly, they seem utterly meaningless. How can you have a slow, dignified funeral procession for a boy whose body will never be recovered from the mud of Flanders? How can an entire nation dress in black crepe when almost every family is a family in mourning? The resources are not there. The fabrics are needed for uniforms and bandages. The national mood is one of grim, stoic resolve, not of theatrical sorrow. Mourning becomes a much more private and internalized affair. You see a woman who has received that dreaded telegram from the War Office. She might wear a black armband, or a simple black dress, but the elaborate, multi-stage uniform of the widow's weeds is gone. There is no time, no money, unfriendly, no heart for it. The idea of shutting oneself away for a year of seclusion seems like a self-indulgent luxury when there is war work to be done, when the nation is fighting for its very survival. Here's a small but incredibly poignant detail that shows how the very nature of memorialization changed. Because there were no graves to visit for so many of the fallen, a new kind of monument emerged, the cenotaph, which literally means empty tomb. The Great Cenotaph in Whitehall, London, became the nation's focal point of grief. A symbolic grave for 1 million lost men. People would lay wreaths there, a collective, public act of remembrance that replaced the individual, family-centric rituals of the cemetery. The scale of the grief had become too vast for the old ways to contain. The scholarly consensus on this point is quite clear. The First World War was the decisive endpoint of the Victorian mourning culture. Historians of death and grieving point to this period as a great rupture, a moment when the relationship between the living and the dead was fundamentally reconfigured. The elaborate, public performance of sorrow was replaced by a more restrained, stoic, and nationalized form of remembrance. The focus shifted from the individual mourner's journey to the collective memory of the nation's sacrifice. After the war, the world is a different place. The old certainties are gone. The 1922s roar in with a frantic, almost desperate energy. The young people who survived the war want to live, to dance, to forget. The elaborate, heavy, and restrictive traditions of their grandparents' generation now seem not just old-fashioned, but like something from another planet. The long, dark 19th century is finally, definitively over. The black crepe has been put away for good, but even now, in our own modern world, if you look closely, you can still find the faint, ghostly echoes of that strange and somber time. And so, here we are, back in our own time, the world of gaslight, horse-drawn hearses, and dresses made of human hair feels a million miles away. A strange, sepia-toned dream. We live in a world that is often seen as death-denying. We have sanitized the process, handing it over to professionals in hospitals and funeral homes. Our grief is expected to be a quiet, private, and relatively brief affair. You might get a few days of bereavement leave from work, and then you are expected to return, to carry on, to be productive. The long, public performance of sorrow is a lost art. But is it truly gone, or has it simply changed its form? You look around, and the echoes of the Victorian way of death are still there, if you know where to look. We may not have mourning warehouses, but we still have a multi-billion-dollar funeral industry that offers a dizzying array of choices, from the type of casket to the flower arrangements. The pressure to give a loved one a good send-off, and the financial anxieties that come with it, is a feeling the Victorians would have understood perfectly. We no longer wear black for a year, but the tradition of wearing a black suit or dress to a funeral is a direct, albeit diluted, descendant of those strict Victorian dress codes. It is the last remnant of that vast, color-coded language of grief. The obituary, a newspaper column that the Victorians helped to popularize, has now migrated online, becoming a digital memorial page where people can leave condolences and share memories. It serves the exact same function, a public announcement and a space for communal grieving. And what about the memento mori, the tangible keepsake of the person we have lost? We may find post-mortem photography unsettling, but in our digital age, we have our own versions. We keep the photos of our loved ones on our phones. We watch old videos to hear their voice. We preserve their social media profiles as digital ghosts. Timelines frozen in their final moment. The desire to hold onto an image, a trace, a part of the person, is a deeply human instinct that hasn't changed at all. Even the strangest of all customs, the hair jewelry, has its modern, if less common, counterparts. There are now companies that will take the ashes of a deceased person, using immense heat and pressure, compress them into a synthetic diamond, a memorial diamond that you can wear in a ring or a pendant. It is the 21st century version of a woven hair brooch, a way of turning the physical remains of a person into a beautiful, wearable, and permanent keepsake. It's a practice that a sentimental and scientifically minded Victorian would have absolutely loved. Historians and sociologists who study modern grieving practices often point to this enduring legacy. They argue that while we have shed the most oppressive and theatrical aspects of Victorian mourning, we are still grappling with the same fundamental questions. How do we properly honor our dead? How do we navigate our own sorrow? How do we balance our private feelings with public expectations? The academic debate continues. Have we lost something valuable in our move away from ritual? Did the Victorians, for all their excesses, have a healthier, more honest relationship with death because they were forced to confront it? to live with it, to literally wear it on their sleeves? Or have we wisely liberated ourselves from a morbid, expensive, and emotionally suffocating set of traditions? There is, of course, no easy answer. The story of Victorian mourning is a story of contradictions. It was a time of sincere, heartfelt grief and of cynical, commercial exploitation. It was a source of great comfort for some and a cause of profound misery for others. It was beautiful and it was bizarre. It was a deeply human attempt to impose order and meaning on the ultimate chaos. And as you stand here, at the end of this long journey, you can see that while the fashions have changed, the fundamental human need to remember, to honor, and to find a way to say goodbye has not changed at all. The quiet echoes of their elaborate sorrows are still all around us, woven into the fabric of our own quieter goodbyes. And so, our journey through this quiet, sepia-toned world comes to a gentle close. The black-plumed horses have returned to their stables, the heavy crepe veils have been folded away, and the silent, stone-carved angels in the garden cemetery are now bathed in the soft light of a distant moon. You can feel the weight of that strange and somber time begin to lift, like a heavy woolen coat being gently removed from your shoulders. The story is now just a soft, fading echo in the quiet of your room. You can allow the details to blur, the names and the dates to dissolve into a gentle mist. There is nothing left to analyze, nothing left to understand. There is only the feeling of stillness, a deep and comfortable quiet that the Victorians themselves sought in their beautiful gardens of sleep. And perhaps you can feel yourself drifting there now, into your own quiet garden of rest, where the pathways are soft, and the air is calm, and the only sound is the gentle rhythm of your own breathing. The final word has been whispered. If your mind is still gently stirring, you're welcome to drift into another of my stories. If not, I wish you a deep and peaceful slumber. Good night.